The wind carried a sharpness that cut the skin like a blade, whistling down from the peaks where the snow clung heavy against the black line of pines. Smoke curled upward from the lone chimney on the slope, a thin gray ribbon trembling in the pale sky. She walked toward it with careful steps, her worn boots sinking into the drifts, the hem of her faded dress heavy with frost. An Apache woman, moving quietly as if afraid even the mountain itself might reject her. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, stitched from scraps and smelling faintly of wood smoke. In her arms she carried nothing but herself. No bundle, no trunk, only the stubborn weight of her own breath in the cold. The cabin came into view, its walls darkened by years of storms, the logs pressed tight against the wind. No welcome waited at the door, only the sound of a dog's bark and the creak of the pine swaying. She paused before knocking, her hand trembling just once before she pressed her knuckles to the rough wood. The sound echoed small and hollow in the valley. The door opened slow. He stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his face carved by wind and grief. The mountain man said nothing at first, only studied her with eyes narrowed against suspicion. She bowed her head slightly, the way one does when expecting dismissal. "I've come," she said softly, her voice nearly lost to the hiss of the wind, "to cook, if you'll have it." For a moment, silence pressed between them. Then he stepped back, letting her cross the threshold. The cabin was dim, warm only near the fire where two children sat huddled together. They watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, their cheeks flushed from the cold. The boy, older by a few years, gripped a stick of whittled pine. The girl clutched a rag doll against her chest, its head nearly torn loose from the stitching. Both looked at the woman, as though she were a shadow fallen across their hearth. She moved without speaking, setting her shawl aside, her breath white in the chill of the room. The fire burned low, the pot on the hearth nearly empty. She knelt, fed and kindling, and soon flames licked high, painting her cheeks with light. From the corner of her eye she saw the man watching, arms folded, shoulders tense. He offered no greeting, no word of comfort, only silence. She busied herself at once. Flour dust clung to her fingers as she mixed dough on the worn table. The scent of yeast and smoke mingled, softening the edges of the air. The children drew closer, inch by inch, curiosity overcoming fear. The girl whispered something into her brother's ear, and he shushed her, though his own gaze never left the woman's hands. She felt their eyes upon her, small and searching, and though she kept her head low, a faint hum rose in her throat. A song, no more than a thread of melody, steady and quiet. It was not for them, not even for herself, but for the silence that filled the cabin too thick. When the bread rose golden from the oven, she set it before them. The man broke it, passing pieces to the children. They ate quickly, hunger softening their suspicion. She waited until they were finished before taking a small crust for herself, chewing slow as if to hide the hunger that clawed at her belly. Not a word passed her lips after that. The day sank toward night. Snow tapped gently against the window, each flake dissolving into darkness. She gathered her shawl and laid it on the floor by the fire. That was where she would rest, though no one had told her so. The man said nothing. The children whispered beneath their blankets, voices hushed and quick. She heard them through half-closed eyes. "She smells like cedar," the girl murmured. "She sounds like a song," the boy replied. "Will she stay? I don't know." The woman turned her face toward the wall, her lashes damp with melting snow, still clinging there. She had been called many things in town, outcast, unwanted, less than human. Even now she felt those names pressing at her back like cold hands. Here in the mountains, far from the wagging tongues, she thought perhaps she might find a silence that was kinder. But silence too could wound. The fire dimmed to embers. The dog outside gave a low, mournful howl. She closed her eyes and let the sound carry her into restless dreams. Yet in that same silence something fragile stirred. A spark not yet seen, but felt in the way the children had drawn close, in the way their eyes had softened, in the way their father, though hardened and distant, had not turned her out into the snow. She belonged nowhere, not in the town, not in memory, not in the stories whispered about her. But for one fleeting breath, as the embers glowed faint red against the dark, She wondered if the walls of this cabin might hold more than rejection. The mountain slept uneasy. The children shifted in dreams. And she, curled in a thin shawl by the ashes, listened to the wind rattle the eaves and thought. Perhaps even in the silence of winter, something tender might survive. Morning crept slowly across the ridge, pale light spreading over the snow-packed world. Inside the cabin, the woman stirred first. She rose from her place near the ashes, the shawl still damp with frost, and tended the fire. Her breath ghosted in the chill, curling into the shadows before fading. She moved with care, setting wood upon the coals, coaxing flames to life until the room warmed with their glow. The man emerged from his bed in silence, his boots striking the floor with measured weight. His eyes swept the room once, settling briefly on her before drifting away, as though he dared not linger too long. He sat at the table, waiting, hands clasped as if holding himself together. No greeting came. None was expected. The children stirred under their quilts. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes and wandered close to the hearth, drawn by the smell of beans simmering in the pot. The girl clutched her ragged doll and climbed onto the bench, her small face watching the woman's every motion. They whispered little things, half laughter, half wonder, as though she carried secrets in the movements of her hands. She baked bread once more, her fingers dusted white with flour. The boy leaned forward, studying her palms as if they carried answers to questions he had never spoken. She did not meet his gaze. Instead, she hummed, a low melody that wound to the rafters like smoke. The children leaned closer, not daring to break the song spell. The man ate with the same stern silence as before, chewing each bite as though it were duty rather than nourishment. She served him without comment, her own portion smaller than any of theirs. The children, however, found comfort in her quiet kindness. The girl giggled when the woman placed an extra slice on her plate. The boy straightened with pride when the woman nodded the way he offered thanks before eating. When the chores were done, she sat by the fire with a shirt torn at the seam. Her fingers threaded the needle with practiced ease. The girl watched in wonder as the fabric drew close, each stitch neat and patient. "It's like magic," the child whispered, but the woman only smiled faintly, eyes lowered. That night, when the lantern glowed soft against the log walls, she told them a story in the cadence of her people. The words were not all English. Some slipped into her mother's tongue, lilting, rhythmic, older than the mountains. The children leaned against their sides, listening as though the world itself paused to hear. Their father sat apart in the corner, sharpening his knife, but his eyes flicked toward them once, lingering a heartbeat longer than habit allowed. Days passed in that rhythm. Dawn to dusk she worked, mending, cooking, tending the fire. The man spoke little, his grief locked deep, yet his silence carried less steel with each passing night. The children bloomed under her presence, laughter weaving to the rafters where once only stillness reigned. But beyond the cabin walls, the world whispered. In the settlement down the valley, tongues wagged over mugs of bitter coffee. "The widower's gone soft," one voice muttered, "taken in an Apache woman to cook his meals." Others shook their heads. "Think of his children, raised by her. What will become of them?" The words drifted like smoke, sour and heavy. She heard them once when she came to trade flour, her eyes lowered as the women turned their backs. The shame pressed into her chest like a stone, yet she carried it home in silence. That evening, she baked cornbread, the smell filling the cabin with warmth. The children clapped their hands in delight, but she could not shake the sting of the town's judgment. She ate nothing that night, her appetite gone. The man noticed, though he said nothing. His eyes lingered a little longer upon her as the children laughed, and something unspoken flickered across his face. Later, when the little girl grew restless in her sleep, the woman sang a lullaby so soft it seemed more breath than sound. The song wove around the cabin like a prayer, steady and tender, pulling the child back into dreams. The boy, half awake, whispered, "You sing like the wind in the trees." The woman laid her hand gently against his hair, her heart tightening in her chest. Still, she knew the precariousness of her place. She was not family, not kin, not welcome in the eyes of the town. Each gesture, each smile from the children, was a fragile gift, easily broken by the world beyond these walls. Yet she could not help the way her hands reached for them, how her voice softened when they called her near. The man kept to himself, though now and then she caught his gaze lingering when he thought her turned away. He spoke fewer words of command, more words of simple need. More would, "Pass the salt, thank you." They were small, but they were words, and that was something. One night, after the children had drifted into dreams, he remained at the table, staring at the knife he no longer sharpened. She sewed in the corner, the lamplight bending across her dark hair. He looked up once, and though his mouth stayed silent, his eyes carried a weariness that spoke louder than words. She lowered her gaze, feeling both the weight of his grief and the quiet shift beginning to stir within him. By the week's end, the children's devotion was no longer hidden. They brought her wild flowers pressed flat between pages of an old Bible, the stems brittle but precious. She tucked them into her apron, close to her heart. At supper, the boy announced that he wanted to learn her songs, his voice breaking with excitement. The girl leaned against her side, whispering, "Don't leave." The fire glowed steady, throwing shadows against the walls. Outside, the world gossiped and judged, but within these walls, something else was forming. Not yet love, not yet belonging, but the shape of both. She sat quietly as the children drifted to sleep against her, her needle paused in her hand. The man turned from his corner, his gaze steady, and for the first time since her arrival, the silence between them felt less like rejection and more like waiting. In that pause, in that fragile hush of evening, she realized she was no longer merely the cook. She was becoming something else, something the children already felt, and something the father, though he could not yet admit it, had begun to see. The storm came down from the high ridge without warning, thick sheets of snow blinding the valley, howling against the cabin walls until the timbers groaned. The world beyond vanished into white, leaving only the crack of branches snapping under the weight of ice. Inside, the air grew thin with hunger. The stores dwindled fast, the sacks of flour nearly empty, the beans counted one by one. The woman bent over the table, rolling scraps of dough thinner than paper, stretching every ounce of food into something that might fill a belly. Her hands never wavered, though her own ribs pressed sharp beneath her dress. The children watched her with quiet faith, as though her touch alone could turn scarcity into abundance. The man stood near the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out at the blizzard. His shoulders carried the heaviness of a man who had known loss too long. But now he turned, watching her with something new in his eyes. Not suspicion, not hardness, but the beginning of recognition. He had seen women falter under less. Yet she bore the storm as if it were nothing but another trial carved by the earth itself. The children broke the silence with laughter, their voices bright against the howl of the wind. They begged her for a tale, and she relented, her voice low, weaving a story of the mountains, of deer leaping across hidden streams and hawks wheeling high above. The girl leaned into her side, hair slipping across her shoulder. The boy grinned wide, forgetting for a moment to gnaw hunger. Their father's knife rested dull on the table, forgotten in his hand as he listened, uninvited but unable to turn away. When the story ended, she braided the girl's hair, her fingers careful, steady, as though each twist bound more than strands together. She hummed under her breath, a rhythm that matched the crack of the fire. The man's gaze softened, his jaw working as if he wished to speak, but the words clung stubborn in his throat. At last he managed only two. "Thank you." She bowed her head, nearly startled by the sound of his gratitude, for it carried a weight greater than its size. The storm raged on for days, sealing them in. When the roof creaked beneath heavy snow, the man climbed to clear it, his figure swallowed by the blizzard. He returned numb and near frozen, stumbling as he crossed the threshold. She pulled him close to the fire, her hands firm on his shoulders as she stripped away the ice-crusted coat. For a moment their eyes met, his raw with exhaustion, hers filled with a quiet strength. He looked away first, but the warmth of her touch lingered long after. That evening, she stitched a doll for the little girl, piecing scraps of cloth into something whole. The child hugged it to her chest with joy, whispering secrets into its ear. The boy, not to be left aside, asked to learn how to set snares. She promised to show him when the snow relented. In those small moments, the cabin seemed less a prison and more a home. But the world outside did not forget them. One afternoon, when the storm broke enough for a trader to ride through, the man invited him in. The visitor's eyes narrowed when he saw her tending the fire. His mouth curled with disdain. "So it's true," he muttered. "You've let one of them raise your young." His words dripped venom, each one heavy with the prejudice the valley had long held. The woman stiffened, shame rushing hot to her cheeks. She turned toward the door, ready to leave, but before she could step away, the children stood. The boy's voice trembled but did not falter. "She keeps us warm. She keeps us fed." The girl clutched her doll tight, tears shining in her eyes. "She's our family." The trader scoffed, spat on the floorboards, and left. The echo of his words remained, though, pressing into silence like a wound reopened. That night she packed her few belongings, setting them quietly by the door. Her heart ached with the weight of departure, knowing the town would never welcome her, that her presence only stained those who gave her shelter. She had carried rejection too long to risk passing it to the children. Yet when the house lay quiet, she heard their soft crying from the loft. Their sorrow broke her resolve. Her hand lingered on the latch, but she could not force herself into the night. She turned back, laying her bundle once more beside the hearth, her breath catching in her throat. From the doorway, unseen at first, the man watched. The fire's glow framed her as she sat bent over his shirt, needle glinting in the lamplight. His chest ached with something unfamiliar, not grief, not duty, but the fragile stirring of hope. She had entered his home as nothing more than a cook, yet now the air itself seemed to shift with her presence. He stepped forward but said nothing, unwilling to break the spell. Instead, he lowered himself into a chair, resting his hands on the table, letting the silence settle thick around them. She did not look up, but she felt his gaze upon her, steady and searching. The children, at last soothed into sleep, breathed softly above. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, another storm, quieter but no less fierce, broke against the walls they had all built around their hearts. Something had changed, fragile as a flame in the wind, yet strong enough to burn through the silence that had kept them apart. The cabin lay hushed in the gray before dawn, its log walls holding the silence of those who had not slept. A faint fire crackled low, casting shadows across the wooden beams. Elena sat near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her dark eyes, usually calm, flickered with unease. She had grown accustomed to the rhythms of this household. The children's laughter, the scrape of boots on the floorboards, the steady presence of the mountain man. But now there was a fracture in the air, something unspoken pressing down on all of them. Thomas stood by the window, shoulders squared, jaw tight. He had faced wolves, storms, and the lean months of hunger without wavering. Yet here he was, caught in a bind no rifle or trap could resolve. The children's plea still echoed in his ears, raw and pleading, "Please stay as our mother." He had no answer for them then, and even now, words seemed brittle against the weight of it. Elena felt the memory of their voices as well. Little hands had tugged at her skirts, eyes wide with need and hope. She had come only to cook, to ease their burdens a few hours each day. Yet the more she stepped across this threshold, the more it felt like crossing into a life she had not meant to claim. She could not deny the warmth she felt when Mary slipped her small hand into hers, nor the tug in her chest when James leaned against her shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Thomas turned at last, his eyes finding hers. There was grit in his gaze, but also a weary softness. "They don't understand what they ask," he said quietly. "A house like this is full of ghosts." "I know," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But children don't ask with reason. They ask with their hearts." His breath caught. He had thought his heart buried with his wife, thought it safer that way. Yet in the evenings, when Elena hummed softly while stirring a pot, or when her laughter escaped unguarded, he felt the ground beneath him shift, and that was dangerous. Outside, dawn broke sharp and cold. The children woke, their chatter carrying through the walls. Thomas braced himself. He could no longer let silence do the speaking. After the meal, he told them to sit, his tone steady but grave. Mary's bright eyes searched him, and James fidgeted, sensing something heavy. Thomas rested his broad hands on the table. "What you asked Elena yesterday," he paused, his throat tightening. "It's not a simple thing. A mother is not chosen like a new pot or a saddle." Mary's lips quivered. "But she makes the house warm again. She listens to us. She cares." James blurted, "We don't want her to leave." The weight of their need struck Thomas harder than any blow he had taken. He looked at Elena, who sat still, her hands folded, her gaze steady though her heart pounded. Elena drew in a breath, choosing her words with care. "Children, I came here only to help. But what you feel, I feel it too. Still, this is not just about what we wish. Your father carries his grief. He must decide what place there is for me." Thomas flinched at her honesty. She had laid the truth bare, and all eyes turned to him. He felt the walls he had built begin to crumble, but the fear of failing them, failing her, burned hot. That night, the storm broke. Wind rattled the shutters, and snow began to fall thick against the mountain. Thomas found himself unable to rest. He stepped outside, the cold biting his face, and stared at the peaks. He thought of his wife's final breath, of the promises he never kept. His chest tightened, but through the ache came another vision. Elena at the hearth, the children safe beside her, a fire burning strong. He returned inside, his boots heavy with snow. Elena was waiting, cloak draped over her shoulders, as if ready to leave. The sight struck him with panic. "You are going," he said, his voice rough. She met his gaze, calm but resolute. "If my presence brings more pain than comfort, I should not stay." He moved closer, his shadow stretching across her. "Pain is what I've lived with. But you've shown me there's still life here. I just don't know if I can ask it of you, to take on my burdens, to mother children not your own." Her voice softened, carrying the weight of both sorrow and hope. "I am not afraid of burdens, Thomas. I am afraid of walls too high to climb." Silence hung thick, broken only by the wind outside. Then, with a voice that trembled though it carried the strength of years, Thomas said, "Stay, not because the children asked, not because I am lonely. Stay because I ask it of you, because I can't let you walk away." Elena's breath caught, the firelight glinting in her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing, then slowly nodded. "Then I will stay, but it must be a promise, Thomas, not half measures, not with one foot in the grave of the past." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, rough and trembling. "A promise, then, to you, to them, to life again." From the loft, a small voice whispered, "Mama?" It was Mary, awake and listening. Her eyes shone through shadows. Elena's heart broke and mended all at once. She knelt, arms open, and Mary rushed into them. Thomas stood behind, watching as James clambered down the ladder to join them. The children clung to Elena as if they had found home at last. The storm outside howled, but within the cabin a warmth rose that no winter could quench. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the weight on his chest lift, replaced by something fragile yet fierce. Hope. He looked at Elena, her arms around his children, and knew that the walls had fallen. He would keep his promise.